I am Dr. Sean McFate, and I am a professor of war. Today we're going to discuss Clausewitz, Jomini, and the utility of force. There are many in the West today who believe Clausewitz is the most important strategic thinker who ever lived. But it wasn't always so. Henry Jomini, in the 19th century and much of the 20th, was actually considered the most important strategic thinker, and Clausewitz was largely forgotten, unknown. Today, their thinking, I believe, makes more sense if you look at them together, because they agree on more than they disagree. The two men were contemporaries, forged in the battles of Napoleon. In the early 19th century, Napoleon changed warfare as much as he changed the European map and the way we think about strategy today. Clausewitz fought on the side of the Prussians, where Jomini fought on the side of Napoleon. This war and the type of warfare it introduced dominated European strategic thought throughout the 19th century, throughout the age of empire, and only was changed violently during World War I. However, the ideas of Clausewitz and Jomini remain integral to Western strategic thought today, and you will recognize their DNA in how we think about strategy and warfare to this day. Now, both men believed very highly in this idea of utility of force. Now, this is not a term that they would have used or recognized, but the concept behind it they would have. It's a term that we use today. The utility of force simply means the usefulness of physical force or violence in war. Specifically, the usefulness of physical force or violence to win wars. And they ranked it very high. Force to them was the ultimate decider in international politics. War was the international decider, and it was won by organized violence. Now, we will see later on how other strategic thinkers disagree with them, but here Jomini and Clausewitz are in lockstep. And they are seminal thinkers in what we think about as conventional warfare. People often use the term conventional war, but that's incorrect. It's actually a type of warfare, hence it's conventional warfare. And when you think about conventional warfare, think about World War I, World War II, Napoleonic warfare. It's the War of Westphalia with militaries acting as gladiators between states in an organized, war way. It's the war of uniforms, the nominal laws of war, all of those things, industrial strength warfare. This is what conventional war looks like, and these are seminal thinkers, blueprint drafters of this type of warfare. Now, we're going to talk about Clausewitz first, and then we're going to switch to Jomini. Clausewitz, who was he? What is war in his mind? What is warfare in his mind? And other core concepts. Then we'll switch to Jomini. Who was he? We're going to compare him to Clausewitz because they have a lot more in common than not. And we can use Clausewitz to help us understand what Jomini is thinking. Then we'll look at three core concepts of Jomini that still might be relevant today. And then we're going to weigh his legacy today versus, say, Clausewitz. Is Clausewitz overrated, Jomini underrated? Are they rated where they should be? Are they both overrated? Are they both underrated? So let's look at Clausewitz first. Now, in the U.S. military, this is how they think about Clausewitz. He is the prophet of war. People read On War, his book, as if it's scripture, and they quote it as such. If you want to add legitimacy to your strategic argument, just drop a few quotes from Clausewitz. But it wasn't always so. Clausewitz was actually unknown for the most part in the 19th century. The person who was seen as the prophet of war was Jomini, not Clausewitz. This only changed in the 1970s, where they flipped. Nobody's ever heard or reads Jomini anymore. Everybody reads and quotes Clausewitz everywhere. We'll discuss why that might be later on. So, who was this man, Clausewitz? Well, he was a Prussian during the Napoleonic Wars. And Prussia, just so you know, it's a state that no longer really exists. It was sort of like Berlin, its capital in many ways, in Northeast Europe. The old joke is that Prussia was not a state with a military, but a military with a state. It was very militaristic, but it was also seized with the Enlightenment. And Frederick the Great, the ruler of Prussia, was seen as one of the enlightened despots, a man who engaged everything in from war to philosophy, such as Immanuel Kant, who was a Prussian, to art. He played the flute, and C.P.E. Bach, the son of Bach, was who's then the Mick Jagger of music in Europe, was his, he was teaching him how to play the flute. So he was what we call Renaissance man, talking about Frederick the Great. And this is the Prussia that Clausewitz was reared in. Now, he had an unremarkable career for a Prussian. I mean, for you and I, he tapped out as a 2-star general. He did very well. But Prussians, where the military was part of culture, he was a staff officer, shall we say, not a commander. He joined the army early, like many officers. He joined at age 11, maybe 12. By 40, he was a 2-star general. He attended the Kriegsakademie, which was, Prussia's war college in 1801, their CISA in 1801. And he studies the classics of like Plato and Kant, which was normal for a student of the Enlightenment, and he was a child of the Enlightenment, as was Prussia in general. Prussian society was very much in the sway of that. And he also studied the strategic manuals of his day. We don't read them anymore because they're very 18th century and not relevant to today. Now, he was taken as a POW by Napoleon's army in 1806. He was wounded at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstadt in 1806. And during this period of time, he grew to hate Napoleon's army, as did many Prussians, although he admired Napoleon's strategic thinking. So he was not, he was able to clear his biases, but he had a lifetime, as many, hatred for Napoleon. Now, he defected, like many Prussians, after Prussia lost to Napoleon and sort of became subsumed in the Napoleonic blob that went to attack Russia in its ill-fated campaign of 1812. He and many other Prussians defected from Prussia to fight with the Russian Tsar in the German regiment or the German Legion. And he does. And he also then fights along. So the Prussians actually are against Napoleon in Waterloo. He's involved in that fight. And then after Waterloo, they make him the commandant of the war college, which he did not want. He wanted to be a commander, not a staff officer. But they made him a professor, and we're glad that they did, because he writes the text on war when he's a professor for the next 15 or so years, 17 years. He's the chancellor of the Kriegsakademie. Now, he dies in 1831 prematurely from cholera, and while crushing a Polish rebellion. So there's interesting about this is that Poland, as many of you know, was sort of, frankly, the doormat of Europe. It has a really complex history of existing, not existing, regardless of having a Polish identity. At this point, it was part of, I think, the Russian Empire, this part was, but it was always chopped up between empires. And there was a huge Polish rebellion of Polish military cadets in 1830, showing Polish nationalism, which was on the rampage in the early 19th century. And he is sent to be the chief of staff of the Prussian army to help crush the Polish rebellion. Now, in the middle of this rebellion is Europe's first encounter with cholera, a killer disease, and it wipes out armies on all sides, including Clausewitz. Now, all we have is, what he leaves after he dies are notes of the book. Not a book or a draft of On War, but notes of a book. Which to this day is, well known but little read. This was from somebody from the 1867 era saying, well known but little read. That could be an epitaph that still matters today. He is often the most quoted guy, but least understood guy in the Pentagon. Now, the reason why On War is so difficult to read, and I'm sure you all struggled through it. There's a lot of reasons. The most important reason is that it's not finished. It is basically his. It's a draft. So imagine this: is that you're writing a thesis, and you give your thesis advisor 2 half chapters and an outline, and then you get hit by a bus, and then your spouse then takes your notes and then publishes those notes. That's what On War is. It's not even a draft manuscript. It's not even a full manuscript. It's like parts of book 1 and parts of book 8 are kind of complete. The middle parts are just notes, like an outline. So it's an unfinished book. And that is why it is so hard to read. The other reasons is that it hasn't been read for 150 years. Like I said, Jomini was the king of strategic thought in the 19th and early 20th century. Clausewitz was unknown. Some people like Eisenhower read it because Eisenhower came from a German community in America and could read the actual German text. It wasn't well translated. The translations into English were heavily edited, selected. They were poor translations. The quotes are often taken out of context. I'm sure you may have witnessed that yourself in your own careers. It was, Clausewitz has been corrupted by critics and even more so by fans. It was revived, though, in the 1970s, arguably in the U.S. Navy War College, because it was seen as a strategic rethinking of what happened to the U.S. Armed Forces in Vietnam. So coming out of the Vietnam War, the U.S. Navy War College, particularly Admiral Stansfield Turner, did 2 things which are still legacies today in the War College curriculum. One is drop Jomini and read Clausewitz. The second is read the Peloponnesian War. Right? Those became the vogue, and it's this legacy that we still tap upon today. And as I said, is that Clausewitz is often the most quoted yet least understood man in the Pentagon. Today's lecture is trying to help you to go through the fog of war of understanding about Clausewitz and understand what is real from what somebody may be using out of context, because that can be very powerful when you're having a strategic debate with a colleague. So why did he write this book? Well, he was an educator. He was a professor but he was a scholar practitioner. All of our theorists in this course are scholar practitioners. The reason is because abstract theory is not enough to understanding war. Having a little skin in the game and a little experience is vital. And that's what's the difference between a political science department with their abstract theories about strategy, which often don't relate well to events on the ground. However, the opposite side is, people who take, they're colonels one day and now they're colonel professors the next day. And simple experience in the field is also not enough. So academic theory is not enough. Experience is not enough either. You need to do both, as Clausewitz did. And one joke about this is Frederick the Great, who was the leader of Prussia in his day. He died. Frederick the Great was not the leader of Prussia in his day. He was much earlier. But Frederick the Great he joked that a mule, though he should have made 10 campaigns under Prince Eugene, would not have improved in his tactics. Many old officers are not superior to such a mule. In other words, you can have 10 or 20 military campaigns under your belt by the time your career is over. That doesn't by itself make you wise. So the moral of this story is this: don't be an ass, right? Don't be an ass. And this is what he talks about. He says that, he complains that war college professors in his day, in the early 19th century, were basically old officers who never rise above the anecdote, who just tell war stories, rather than looking at the deeper general factors that govern the matter, rather than digging deep and finding out what are the trends, the causal effects, all these things that we seek to understand through critical thinking about life, this phenomenon, what makes war happen and why, and all those things. So, and ask yourself, how much do we see of this today in our own war college system, right? So you hear people tell war stories as if it's a graduate level education. It's not. War stories are important because they contextualize the learning, but if you have a professor who is nothing but war stories, they're not much help any more than you have a professor who's nothing but academic theory. So here are some Clausewitzian core concepts that we're going to discuss today. I am not going to list them all because we're going to get to them, but there's quite a few. And many argue that these are as relevant today as they were in the early 19th century. Others argue less so. I leave it for you to decide. So if you think of On War as Clausewitz's thesis, what do you think his thesis question was? Well, the hint is in the title. His question is, what is war? Right? What is war? He's not thinking small here. He's thinking big, which I encourage you all to think about someday. Think big. His answer, which we all know the bumper sticker version of it, is this. War is merely the continuation of politics by other means. If there's one quote that everybody knows about Clausewitz, it's this quote. If there's one quote you're going to hear in the Pentagon or someplace, some commander's office or day room someplace, it's this. There should be T-shirts and bumper stickers made up with this. It's the one quote everybody knows, but does everybody understand it? That's a different question. And by the way, just so you know, that the word for politics and policy is the same word in German. It's Politik, okay? Some people translate this as war is merely the continuation of policy by other means. I like politics because I think it gets closer to the connotation, but they mean the same thing. So unless you want to write a PhD on this, let's move forward. So for him, war is armed politics. He says this over and over again throughout his books and on war, particularly in books 1 and books 8. All war can be considered acts of politics or policy. War should never be thought of as something autonomous, but always as an instrument of policy. No one starts a war, or rather no one should start a war, unless he intends to achieve something political with it. Otherwise, it's just carnage and tyranny. He says this, war has its own grammar, but not its own logic. What do you think this means? War has its own grammar, but not its own logic. It's a profound statement, I think. What he means by this is this. The logic is politics, a political end. The grammar is violence. So think of it this way. Economics has its own grammar, but not its own logic. Foreign policy and diplomacy have its own grammar, but not its own logic. They all serve the national interests of the state, the political, nature of the state. War is one more tool in the toolkit, right? It has its own grammar, which is mostly, violence in the world of Jomini and Clausewitz. Think of Napoleon. The implications of this are interesting. So it means, first of all, that war's purpose is political. It's not tyranny. It's not glory or anything like that. We can discuss economics, if you wish, in a Q&A session. War is neither a separate entity nor a last resort. He doesn't look at war like laws of armed conflict look at war. He doesn't look like war as a pacifist or a Quaker who looks at war. War is a rational choice of decision makers. It is started and ended by politicians because it's a political It's a political problem set. And you're using the military in it and the grammar of violence to achieve the political ends. So war is politics by other means. It's armed politics. Now, the objective of war is to compel the enemy to do our will, which I'm sure most military officers today would say, yeah, that sounds about right. And he describes it as a clash between major interests. Think of great states, great power competition that is resolved by bloodshed. It's armed politics, and it's the only way in which it differs from other conflicts, whether they be diplomacy or trade wars or anything else. These are how states work out their political differences. In this case, they take to the battlefield. And he compares them to like gladiators for states, right? And militaries are the gladiators. Militaries are the gladiators. So this is state-on-state warfare, interstate warfare, who work out their political differences, in this case, by their militaries that act as gladiators for the state. And this can be to the death. And this is the essence of Westphalian War. Clausewitz and Jomini are, in my opinion, Westphalian War Strategists. They describe a way to win in a Westphalian system. And one of the questions I want you to think about coming out of this lecture is, if we are in a post-Westphalian era, does this way of war still matter as much? Maybe we're not in a post-Westphalian era, and this matters a great deal. Is this what great power competition will look like? Or will great power competition look very different? All the theorists that we're going to look at in the rest of this course will have something to say about that answer. And it's up to you to decide where you fall along that spectrum, if you fall anywhere, and maybe you make up your own theory, and we'll be teaching you someday. Lastly, he's a realist. So he says war is bloody and violent, and that might sound like a blinding flash of the obvious, but that's not the case for his generation. People in the Enlightenment, war strategic thinkers, people who write, doctrine about war and how to win when there were many, tended to treat war in a very clinical and anodyne way. The way that doctors talk about medicine. You don't talk about a dead body, you talk about a cadaver, right? People do the same thing. You could be reading a war text and not realize that people are getting their heads blown away by 50 caliber musket balls, right? So war, he reminds us, is bloody and violent. And he doesn't talk about ethics in war. He takes a position that, look, once a legitimate authority has declared war, it's your duty to wage war as efficiently as possible to mitigate human suffering. And that kind-hearted people who may have noble intentions, as nice as that sounds, he says, it actually backfires. It's counterproductive. It basically elongates and protracts conflicts so that more innocent people suffer, that the war spreads over time, and that the very worst mistakes are often committed by kind-hearted people who want to do good things but just make the situation worse. So Clausewitz has a strict no unicorns and rainbows policy. He looks at war for what it is. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't talk about the war ethics, but he's keenly aware of the ethical implications in this. And think about this today. Think about experiences like in the Balkans when you had international lawyers on the elbow of, JAG officers, the elbow of every commander telling them what to do, what not to do. Do the laws of armed conflict, do they prolong and exacerbate wars? Do humanitarian interventions prolong or exacerbate wars? Perhaps it's better to let wars burn themselves out in the short run and then work on post-conflict in the long run. Or maybe the opposite is true. Maybe that's the very worst thing you can do. But think about that today, because it seems as relevant today as it was in Clausewitz's day. Okay, now let's go to the corollary question he asks. And this is the really interesting one. What is the nature of war? Remember, he talks about, you don't want to be that war professor who's just talking about their own glory days and hyped up war stories. There I was in Kandahar and blah, blah, blah. He wants to know, what are the governing principles of a phenomenon? What is the nature of war? Now, as you're all good thesis students, you know that it's not simply good enough to have a good research question. This is a pretty awesome research question. But you need some sort of analytical methodology to help you puzzle it out, right? This is a puzzle. So what is his analytical methodology to answer that very profound and abstract question? What is the nature of war? Now, many 20th century scholars like Peter Parrott and Michael Handel assert that Clausewitz takes a dialectical approach to his military analysis. But this is not so. And this has caused great confusion for students of Clausewitz for the last 4 or 5 decades. There is scant evidence for Clausewitz using the, quote, dialectical approach. And students who look for it generally end up confused and frustrated. So let's take a moment to explain what the dialectical approach is first so you don't get confused too. The dialectical approach is attributed to George Hegel, a famous German philosopher who lived in Berlin during Clausewitz's lifetime. We don't think they knew each other, but it's likely that Clausewitz would have known Hegel because Hegel was one of the most, and to this day, famous philosophers of modern European philosophy. Right? He is a super powerhouse in philosophy. So it's likely that Clausewitz heard of him and may have read him and could have gotten the idea of a dialectical approach from Hegel this way. So there's like circumstantial evidence. The word dialect, however, it comes from the word dialogue. So, it's part of Hegel's epistemology, and epistemology in philosophy is the philosophy of knowledge. How do we know what we know, which is becoming ever more relevant in modern warfare? How do we know what we know? How do we know disinformation from misinformation from real information? And that's what epistemology helps you to understand. And Hegel, his whole construct for understanding epistemology is this: the dialectic approach, which comes from dialogue. So think about it this way. It comes in a 3-step process, and imagine it like a dialogue. First step, somebody makes a claim. Second step, somebody else makes a challenge to that claim. Third step, they resolve it by coming up with a solution, like a hybrid solution So, for example, he calls the claim the thesis statement. For example, cats are awesome pets because they are gods. The challenge comes as what he calls the antithesis statement. Cats are terrible pets because they are snooty. The solution that resolves the thesis and antithesis is called the synthesis. And it would be like, cats are good pets if you like being their staff, right? And then that becomes the next thesis statement. And on it goes until knowledge is produced and humans figure out the life, the universe, and everything, right? So that is what the dialectical approach looks like. It's like this 3-step process: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. There's only one problem when it comes to Clausewitz. Clausewitz doesn't use Hegel's dialectic method in his analysis. Yes, he mentions the words thesis, antithesis, synthesis a total of just 8 times. And never as part of a dialectical framework. He never sets up his argument in terms of a dialectical framework with a thesis, an antithesis, a synthesis. This has caused great confusion over the decades because people try to write their thesis, their master's thesis on the dialectical approach, and basically it's a kind of a theory without fact. So what method does Clausewitz use to dissect the nature of war? Well, he does use a method. It's not the dialectical approach. It's something called the ideal type, which was very popular in his day, very popular in the Enlightenment, and was more popular than the dialectical approach that Hegel used. Now, the ideal type comes from Plato's forms. You recall in your readings, Plato, the Republic, he has the analogy or the allegory of the cave, and his idea of forms, like there's a bird, you see a silhouette of a bird in the back of the cave. Well, that is a bird form, right? And there's a real bird, there's an archetype of a bird, which is a Jungian concept, I believe, but there's an archetype of a bird, but all birds are kind of different. So he calls these forms. This gets rediscovered in European philosophy during the Age of Enlightenment, when European philosophers like Locke and others are trying to throw off the shackles, the dogmas of the Catholic Church, the Western Church, and rediscovering the philosophy of antiquity. That was through the help of the Islamic world, which during the Middle Ages was studying these texts of Aristotle and Plato and so forth. So who picks up the Enlightenment? Well, Prussia. Remember we talked about Frederick the Great, an enlightened despot? One of them is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was a fellow Prussian who lived during, a generation before Clausewitz, but he died in 1804. Kant is seen even more than Hegel as arguably the most significant philosopher of modern Western philosophy. And we read him in our political theory course, and his epistemology draws on Plato's ideas of forms. And Clausewitz read Kant, knew Kant. In his early letters, he talks about using Kant's, book called The Critique of Practical Reason, which lays out Kant's epistemology as the background or as the epistemological structure for his book on war. He doesn't talk about Hegel in this way. He does talk about Kant, and we know he read Kant, where Kant lays this out. Now, Kant's philosophy influences Hegel and his dialectical approach, and Hegel talks about this, which influences Karl Marx, who's a young Hegelian, which influences Max Weber, who's a late 19th century, early 20th century sociologist, and Max Weber somehow gets all the credit for this term ideal type. At least in sociology, he does. But really, this methodology for unpacking riddles like what is war traces its roots clearly back to Plato. And Clausewitz is influenced by Kant and his book, The Critique of Practical Reason. Okay, so you're like, great, professor. So what? Who cares? What is the ideal type? Well, let me tell you what the ideal type is by looking at an example. What is the nature of dogs? Right? Remember, Clausewitz is asking, what's the nature of war? But before we go there, let's take a simpler. What's the nature of dogs? Well, we're going to use the methodology of ideal type to answer this question. So the nature of dogs is uniquely the same. And what it is, it's those shared characteristics that distinguish dogs from other animals. So dogs are like all animals, they breathe, they have fur or hair. So that doesn't distinguish them uniquely. So what are the unique features or characteristics of dogs that help us distinguish a dog from a cat, from a parrot, from a salamander? What are those features? Well, I know you're thinking them all. They bark, they howl, they can be trained, they're loyal to humans, they can do guard duty, they can hunt, they like to play, they wag their tails to show happiness, they do all sorts of things that are unique to dogs. And these combined features that are unique to dogs, they form our ideal type of a dog. So if you see an animal in the wild that does these things, it's some sort of dog. All right. So we just constructed an ideal type of a dog based on the common and unique features of a dog. However, we know that in reality, there are many different types of dogs. So we know what an ideal type of a dog is, but we also know that in reality there are many different types of dogs. The ideal type serves to help us identify the nature of the phenomenon, the governing principles of the phenomenon, as Clausewitz talks about it, to help us distinguish that we're looking at a bunch of dogs that look and sound, differently, but they're dogs and not cats. So to rephrase this, what's the nature of dogs? There are many different types of dogs, but the nature of dog remains the same. And it's the same with war. It's the same with war, if you follow Clausewitz's analysis. There are many different types of wars in reality, but the nature of war remains the same. So war for him, he lays out the ideal type of war, the nature of war, which is constant, unchanging. It's the same whether it's, 1000 BC or 180 or 1580 or today or the future. The nature of war remains the same no matter what time it is, what era it is. However, wars in reality change all the time, and we call this warfare or the character of war. And these are different types of war in reality, and it's forever changing. Warfare is forever changing. It depends on technology and leadership and geopolitics, on political objectives, etc., right? So whether you're fighting in Troy or in ancient Troy or the Crusades or World War II or you're fighting dragons, the nature of war is the same. It's violent, it's bloody, it's political. But the character of war or warfare is forever changing, whether you're fighting with a lance or a Sherman tank or a dragon, right? And I leave it up to you which weapon of choice you would choose in those cases. I think for most of you it would be a Dragon WMD. Now here's an important strategic failure alert. Never confuse war with warfare. Now you think this sounds obvious, but you would be surprised. People at senior levels of strategic decision-making do this often. And certainly journalists and non-experts do this even more. So here's a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, a DepSecDef, saying, I am starting to believe very, very deeply that technology is also going to change the nature of war. Right? The nature of war. He's saying that the technology certainly changes warfare. We all know that, whether it's the phalanx or the machine gun, that's an obvious. But he's starting to think that modern technology actually will change the nature of war itself. For which I reply, that's like saying, a new type of clock will change the nature of time. It's ludicrous. But think about this. This is a DepSecDef saying this. And how can this lead to your own strategic failure? Is that you're basically starting to drink your own bathwater, that we have technology that can actually cheat the nature of war. Where does that lead? It leads to things like the Maginot Line is where it leads to. All right, now, so for Clausewitz, let's unpack this idea. What is the ideal type of war? Well, conveniently, unlike the dialectic approach, he actually calls it ideal war, right? This is not a mystery. He calls it ideal war or absolute war. These are the same thing for him. This is part of the ideal type methodology he's using. He says in the ideal type of war, which he also calls absolute war or war in theory, war is an act of force, think of violent force, where there is no logical limit to the application of that force. So each side, therefore, gets into this death spiral of reciprocal action once war starts, which leads, in theory, to the extremes. So once war starts, it consumes everything. It's like a house on fire. So it's an act of violence with no logical limit. So the ideal type of war is an act of organized violence that seeks the extremes. And that pure war, again, as a pure concept, read the ideal type, war would, of its own independent will, usurp the place of politics or policy. meaning that war becomes the ends. It's not just a ways now, it's an end to itself. And it becomes ruled by its own nature. So we go to a Hobbesian universe of a war of all against all. That's war. That's the ideal type of war in theory. It's like a fire consuming a house or a building. It continues to burn and burn and burn until there's no more fuel left and extinguishes by itself. So it's a huge fire of a building without firefighters. This is the nature of war. This is his ideal type of war. He calls it war in theory, ideal war, pure concept, absolute war, abstract concept, always referring to this ideal type of war. Again, it seeks the extremes of violence. It's not rational. It cannot be controlled once it starts, and it escalates without interruption until one side annihilates the other. Until one side annihilates the other. So think of this building burning, this building in front of you, just burning. The fire burns itself out. So it's like a fire without firefighters. That is the ideal type of war. All right. Those are the common features he identifies, just like we identified with the dog, to understand the nature of war. However, he also knows that wars in reality don't look like that. Because he was a student of history. He uses history very wisely. He has a great depth of military history. So here is wars in reality, what we call warfare or the character of war. They are like fires, but they have firefighters. They do not seek the extremes of violence. They do not escalate until one side annihilates the other, or that's actually very rare in military history. There are pauses, there are interruptions, ceasefires, peace treaties. And then there's this other concept of the dual nature of war, total war versus limited war. So wars in reality, just to sum up, he views that in reality, war does not behave like it does in the ideal type. And he also says there's two different types of warfare. There is total war versus limited war. So total wars, these are wars of survival. These are existential wars like World War II or World War I. They seek the complete defeat of the enemy, to destroy him as a political entity and to force him to accept our terms, right? That's what total war is. Limited war is not that. It's short of total war. These are wars of choice. They're not total wars. So these are wars waged for less than total objectives, to retain conquest, to create a bargaining chip. So for example, just say you're at a diplomatic stalemate with an adversary, and what you might do is wage a limited war to grab one of the provinces. And once you grab a province with your military, you come back to the negotiating table with a new bargaining chip saying, hey, I will give you back your province if you give me what I want. So limited war seeks a limited objective. He says they should be short, limited in time frame, and that they are not meant to be existential. He talks about offensive limited wars and defensive limited wars. He calls them wars with limited aims in Book 7. He does talk about limited war. Some think he doesn't, but Book 7 lays it all out. Now, the reason this is a strategic failure alert is that people's will to fight varies because the stakes are different. If you're in a total war versus limited war, it changes how you fight if you're an everyday soldier. And this is how the weak can win against the strong. This is how the weak, as we will see later on in this course with other theorists, the weak are fighting a total war and the strong are fighting a limited war. If this is the case, the weak have a shot at winning against the strong. And we've seen this, have we not, in Vietnam, where the U.S. was fighting a limited war, but the weak were fighting a total war, or the Taliban, or even the American revolutionaries against King George III. All right, so let's put it all up on the board now. Ideal type of war versus limited type of war. Ideal type of war is on your left. It's in the nature of war. It's war in theory. He calls it ideal war. It seeks the extremes of violence. It's like a house burning down without firefighters. Once it takes over, it cannot be stopped, and there's no interruption until one side obliterates the other. But in wars in reality, the different types of wars in reality, the warfare or the character of war, which is always changing, he's noticing that there are firefighters somehow, that there are pauses, that, doesn't burn to extremes. And there's this dual nature of war. There's total wars versus limited wars. So what accounts for the delta? What accounts for what is going on in that green arrow that changes the ideal type of war to wars in reality? Well, he says the answer is what he calls mitigating factors. There are 8 mitigating factors: politics, friction, fog of war, uncertainty, chance, passion, fear, miscalculation, military genius, and moral factors. We're not going to talk about all of them because some of them should be obvious to you: miscalculation, fear, passion, all those things. But we're going to talk about a few. Now, these factors are what, contort the ideal type of war into wars in reality. Right? And the implication of these is that this is what makes war complex and not a complicated problem. And he says this: war is an art and not a science, and treating war like a science will doom you to failure. War is complex. It's a complex phenomenon, not a complicated one. He doesn't use the term complex versus complicated, but that's clearly the philosophical direction he's articulating. So again, from an earlier lecture, a strategic failure alert. Formulaic approaches to strategy fail. There is no checklist for victory. And when we get to Jomini, we'll see, does Jomini, does he make this sin? Does Jomini is very prescriptive, where Clausewitz says such prescription is nonsensical because war is too complex for that simplistic thinking, that facile thinking. And he says this many times. He has all these jabs at Jominian thinkers, which I think are really rich jabs. So again, he says, the idea of using scientific formulas and mechanics, treating war like geometry, is nonsense. It cannot forcibly be learned this way. You can't win through a checklist, is what he's saying here in Book 2, Chapter 2. Or he says this: it's ridiculous that we treat war as a scientific problem for a schoolboy to solve. That is treating war as a complicated problem rather than a complex one. And he says, actually, at the end of the day, what counts most is not academic learning, it's experience. Experience matters more than any amount of abstract truth. When you think of abstract truth, just think of modern political science, right? Think of all these professors who teach in Ivy League towers who have never smelled, the smell of gun smoke in battle, who have no experience outside of Washington, D.C. I'm proud of our civilian faculty at the National Defense University because we get thrown around the world to work with warfighters so that we don't fall into such traps. And I think also having a healthy civilian analysis of war, but one that's steeped in actual experience, is a difference between, say, a National Defense University and Harvard's Department of Government. So let's look at a few mitigating factors and other core concepts. This is what these mitigating factors is the delta, fills the delta between ideal type of war and war in reality, between war and warfare for Clausewitz. The first and most important is this idea of friction, which I think is a very useful concept today. So friction is sort of like Private Murphy. Everything that can go wrong in war will go wrong. And there are certain subcategories of friction. He says there's 8 types in Book 8. The most common ones are fog of war, uncertainty, and chance. And we know from an earlier lecture that the difference between uncertainty and chance is a matter of knowledge. Chance is a percentage of something happening. Well, uncertainty and chance are both a percentage of something may happen, but you don't know how much of a chance or what percentage. So he compares it to running underwater. That is what war is like. That's what friction feels like if you're a commander. It's like running underwater, where everything in war is very simple, but the simplest thing is difficult. And I think if you think about modern war and the nature of war, that still rings true as it ever was. Let's talk about fog of war. Clausewitz is one of the few strategic theorists whose own concepts and ideas have made it into the common vernacular, and fog of war is certainly one of those things. It's a type of friction, and it's caused by lack of information, which he blames on bad intelligence. He thinks intelligence is unworthy. Clausewitz seems like one of those commanders who's been burned by his S2 a lot, or his J2, or the IC in general, and is sort of cynical towards intelligence and the role and the utility of intelligence, as you can see from these quotes on the screen. Many intelligence reports in war are contrary, even more are false, and most are uncertain. This idea of fog of war, we think of as a metaphor, but it really was not a metaphor. In his day, there was not smokeless gunpowder. That came much later in the 19th century. And when masses of troops got in close range and they all fired in a phalanx, because muskets and rifles in that day were so inaccurate that the only way you can inflict injury was firing in mass at a mass, which is why you see these phalanxes getting so close together. And it created a thick smoke that was opaque and that obscured the enemy. And so if you're the commander on the ground, you could hear the enemy. You could see their muzzle flashes, but you couldn't see them. You didn't know where they were. And they were called this the fog of war. And he takes this idea of this thick smoke on a battlefield, that frustrating, the frustration of a commander of not knowing, not having good optics in the situation. He calls that the fog of war. And he reimagines it at the strategic level. At the strategic level, there's a lot of fog of war. So that's where the term fog of war comes from. He also spends a lot of time on this idea of military genius. And for him, the model was his enemy, Napoleon, whom he respected for having military genius. Military genius is this idea that you have a pile of intel reports in front of you of 1,000 slips of paper, and you know exactly what 3 slips to pull and read to make a decisive decision. You have this magical intuition, this genius that really cannot be taught. It's a talent. Some say actually that talent is hitting targets nobody else can hit. Genius is hitting targets nobody else can see. People like Napoleon, Julius Caesar, Alexander, arguably have this military genius. And in the 19th century of great man theory of, historical events are created by great, singular, unique men, Napoleon certainly fits that mold. Now, curiously, he says a strong mind is better than a brilliant one. So a rugged mind more than a brilliant one. And that physical courage is necessary. Physical courage is the first requirement of a commander. Again, he can easily grasp and dismiss 1,000 remote possibilities. He looks at all the COAs and knows exactly the one COA the commander needs to win. He doesn't have to go through 20 different COAs. And again, this comes from experience more than any amount of abstract truth. You're not going to find this in a political science department. You're going to find this by people who've lived it. And perhaps thought about it like Clausewitz. But Napoleon didn't go to a war college or didn't graduate from a great university. He did it by experience. He had talent. And think about that when you read security studies literature. Be savvy to this, I say, is that you want some scholar practitioner balance there, not just the Prince Eugene's mules who are spouting war stories, nor just these professors whose feet never touch the earth, that they're just dealing in abstract truth. And that could be you someday. You could be scholar practitioners. So again, he talks about the inquiring mind rather than the creative mind, the comprehensive mind rather than a specialized approach, and calm. In the middle of a battle, not excitable, not losing your head, not gesticulating like a crazy man or crazy woman. You exude calm. This became a model for military leadership in the 19th century and arguably well into the 20th and today. Let's talk about his Civ Mil for a second too, because he departs from his colleagues. So most of his peers in the early 19th century, and most peers going back to antiquity, believe that in war, once you're at war, a total war, the military should take over, because you don't mess around in a total war with strategic amateurs. So you have the military take over during a time of total war. Once the crisis has passed, once you're victorious, the military leaders hand civil authority back over to civilians, and that's the way it should work. Of course, there are a lot of risks in this, that the military authorities do not hand back civil authorities to civilians and sort of create a military regime, as we saw in Egypt over Hosni Mubarak and others. So let's talk. Clausewitz has an answer to this that's quite nuanced, and it really formulates how the United States thinks about its Civ Mil today. So in his day, he looked at one of the mitigating factors of why wars don't go to their extremes is that you have civilians who are acting as firefighters. They're putting on the brakes and they are holding back generals, right, from going to the extremes. And this is the importance of Civ Mil relationship. The military want to go to the extreme. The civilians want to restrain them. This is the thesis of Huntington. This is the thesis that undergirds American Civ Mil relationship. It's the norm for civil military relationship in America today. Now, this can be on a spectrum. So this is about normal, especially during a time of war. The civilians act as the firefighters as the war blazes on. Now, Civ Mil can be very lovey-dovey, love fest. It can also be just, needs improvement, a dumpster fire. Where do you think your country is today? And I say this to our international students today. How would you place your country on this spectrum? Is it about normal? Is there a love fest between the civilian and the military authorities? Or is it an acrimonious relationship? Let's move on to some other key concepts that you may have heard about. Centers of gravity. Centers of gravity analysis have become a recent vogue in the Pentagon, but it's often misunderstood as where the enemy is weakest but protrudes strength. He talks about this in Book 8, Chapter 4. A center of gravity is a hub of power and movement on which all depends. So a center of gravity is a hub of power. It's a hub of power. He lists three. It's the state's capital, like Paris or Berlin or London. It's the military. It's also the alliance structure. He says the military is a good place to begin because if you take out the military, then you can march onto the capital, you can dissuade allies, you can sort of do it all with one swoop if you can take out the military. Not everything, center of gravity is not always tangible. So center of gravity could be, for example, an ideology, which is one reason we look at legitimacy in ideology. It could be other things too, national identity. It could be many things that you can't simply bomb. And also, it's not always a target. So sometimes you can target a center of gravity. Sometimes you can't. It's not just if we take out this thing, the rest of the house of cards will fall. It's a lot more nuanced than that. He also advises maximum force. So remember we talked about utility of force earlier and Napoleonic warfare. Imagine you're fighting a Napoleonic army. He says you want to mass your force against an enemy's center of gravity. And he calls this the focal point, the concentrated point, the Schwerpunkt. And it's the main effort against the enemy's center of gravity, where they're weakest and where it will, you win if you do this. And again, this enemy's center of gravity may not necessarily be vulnerable to a physical attack or vice versa. Are there ways you can attack it that are, with weapons that don't shoot bullets? I'll leave that to you. He talks about moral factors and ideals, and which was also very revolutionary for his day. Most people in 1804 were writing about the 17th and 16th century, not writing about the future. He had seen Napoleon's levee en masse. He had seen the passion of the French Revolution that Napoleon, at least in the early years, exported to the rest of Europe. And he talks about the zeitgeist, the ideology and legitimacy and how that matters more in war, the will to fight. Lastly, we'll talk about the culminating point of victory. This is a key concept. This is the point of no return for an enemy's recovery. So this is the day that you win the war, but not the day the war is over. Examples are battles like Gettysburg, Stalingrad, Midway. These were the culminating point of victory, or the culminating point of defeat if you're on the other side, where no matter how much the enemy tries to resist you, it's diminishing returns. They are on a down slope. They can never fully recover. It's just a matter of time before they're defeated. So think of D-Day, the invasion of D-Day against the German High Command. It's just a matter of time before Western allies reach Berlin. There's nothing really more that Germany could have done to slow down the war. It was the D-Day, you could argue, was the culminating point of victory on the Western Front of Europe. Same with Gettysburg, same with Midway, same with Stalingrad. Now, let me ask you something. What do you think is better? What kind of warfare do you think is better? Defensive warfare or offensive warfare? What do you think is the stronger form of war? And what do you think wins wars? Now, you might be surprised. Clausewitz's answer, he says offense is preferable. He says that defense is the stronger form of warfare because what he calls has a negative objective, which is self-preservation. So it's stronger. If you're behind your battlement walls, you have an advantage over the attackers because you have you have obstacles, you have cover and concealment, you know the lay of the land. However, he says you cannot conquer from behind your walls. Only offense allows you a positive purpose, which is conquering the enemy. So even though offense is the weaker form, it's the preferable form of war because it allows you to conquer. And both Jomini and Clausewitz, war is about conquest. Later on in this course, we're going to read other strategic thinkers who have a very different point of view about war and a very different answer to this question. And I want you to think about, at the end of the course, what today do you think is more powerful, preferable, offense or defense in war? Clausewitz says the best form of defense is attack, and Jomini would completely agree with that. Now we're going to end that here. He says, before you begin a war, when you're doing your strategic threat assessment, the most far-reaching act of judgment a statesman or a commander can make is, what kind of war are you going to be facing? And this is the first principles question, which it makes sense, but okay, how are we going to do that, Herr Clausewitz? How are we going to do that? And he gives us at least a construct to think about this. He doesn't finish it, which has led to a lot of confusion, a lot of dissertations, a lot of papers, but it's a very powerful construct, or at least some find it to be a very powerful construct. He says you can foretell the ability and behavior of a nation to wage war by looking at three factors. And these factors form what he calls the Trinity. It's an allusion to the Christian Trinity to give it importance as an analytical framework, but his work is not theological. It's just an allusion. So he says, look, every society has these three factors. It has government/reason, military/uncertainty and chance, people/passion. He calls this the Miraculous Trinity, and it helps us answer, how is the war defined? And this is taken from Plato's Republic, which you should recognize. The guardians are the wise, and they are reason, which is the government. The auxiliaries are the warriors. They are the military, which has uncertainty and chance. And the people are passion and the producers. This is it's taken from the Republic. He's not imagining a regime that is like the Republic, but he's borrowing from it. He's a child of the Enlightenment. Everybody read Plato's Republic in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, especially in Prussia. He would have read the Republic, if not in the War Studies or War Academy or War College, on his own, because he was, I think, a scholarly general, scholarly officer. So this is not revolutionary. It's taken from Plato's Republic. It's an analytical tool, as we will see, and how to adjudicate, how to forecast your and your enemy's will to fight and wage war. So here are the elements of the Trinity. The government is the strategic IQ, right? This is the civ-mil relationship, the adequacy of policy and policy strategy match, politics, the use of means and ways to achieve ends, the ability to mobilize support. Then there's the military, the competence of the military, commanders and troops, the suitability of doctrine, of organization, of weapons and training, the admin and logistics of it all. And also the people. How dedicated, how motivated, how supportive are they of the cause, of the government, of the military? All three of these matter. These all matter when you think about war. And this is not fixed. The Trinity is dynamic and changes in war. It changes in peace as well. So he says this. It's like put this triangle on the ground and hold up a pendulum and watch the pendulum move around. The pendulum here is this red dot, and it will move during war and peace, maybe more so during war. It could be something like maybe a peaceful democracy. Maybe it's towards people and government, away from the military. Or maybe a democracy during war. Or perhaps a totalitarian regime, a government which is absolutist. Or how about mob rule? Or warlords in charge? Or how about Plato's Republic? I'm not sure where this would be under Plato's Republic, but I assume towards the philosopher king. So the Trinity may change as the war progresses. Your Trinity, your allies' Trinity, your enemy's Trinity. And you have to be deftly aware of this as a strategist and as a grand strategist. And you have to accommodate accordingly. And again, the Trinity is not in isolation. You should take into account not just your Trinity, your enemy's Trinity, allies' Trinities, neutrals' Trinities, and maybe there's things to exploit there. Both for foreign policy, through covert means, you name it. He does not talk about that. That's McFate talking. That's not Clausewitz talking. Lastly, what is victory? It's the last one, which is, thanks for Clausewitz, but it's a kind of a nice, snappy term. All right. We're going to take a short mental break. We're going to end Clausewitz there, and we're going to turn to Jomini, a contemporary of Clausewitz, both forged in the fires of Napoleonic warfare, but on different sides. Jomini heard of Clausewitz. I don't know if Clausewitz had heard of Jomini. Jomini wasn't quite as famous when Clausewitz was alive as Jomini became later on in the 19th century. These are the famous squares, the British squares, to fight off Napoleon's cavalry. One of the greatest films ever made in terms of grand films, and I believe they used actual soldiers to stage it as extras. All right, Henry Jomini. Let's move to a contemporary of Clausewitz. They agreed on some things, disagreed on other things. They are best understood as a pair, which is why I include them. So here are some core concepts of Jomini, where I'm only sticking to concepts which may be relevant today. There's a lot of things he proposed that are just clearly not relevant today. He talks about interior lines and, cavalry, and I don't think that's as relevant today. You're welcome to dig into that if you wish. We're going to focus on core concepts that are relevant today. So who was Jomini? He was a contemporary of Clausewitz. He was the most read strategist and strategic thinker during the 19th century and into the 20th century. Nobody had heard of Clausewitz. Everybody heard of Jomini. Today it's the opposite. He was a Swiss officer in Napoleon's staff, a staff officer, just like Clausewitz was. Later, he defected to Russia, but for different reasons. He had a sort of a HR disagreement with Napoleon's HR department and said, F you, I'm off, I'm going to fight for the enemy. He later on came back and made amends with the Napoleonic army. He, like Clausewitz, had an unremarkable military career for his day in that he was a staff officer. He made general, but was never in command of a battle, which was the real glory prize. He wrote Art of War in 1838, well after, a couple years after Clausewitz died. I think we believe he read on war in some capacity. I'm not sure when exactly he first read him. There are Clausewitz scholars who say that he really ripped off Clausewitz. It's kind of, I think, hard to prove that because we don't know who read whom first, and they were both influenced by the same experience, Napoleonic warfares. So saying that certain ideas are purely Clausewitz and not Jomini is a question I think historians can debate, but I don't think it's frankly a very academic question, and we will never quite know. There are some scholars have argued persuasively that there are certain elements of his Art of War that he changed in follow-on drafts that they attribute to him reading Clausewitz. So he's also very different than Clausewitz. Unlike Clausewitz, who takes on a real philosopher's stone approach to war, he is writing more of a self-help book for rising generals and rising sovereigns and kings. So his book is written in a very prescriptive manner, like a how-to manual. It's written in a much easier to read French. French was also what everybody read in Europe, whereas Clausewitz was writing in dense Prussian German, like Hegel, not easy to read. Nobody wanted to read it. Also, it was in a draft form, thanks to Marie Clausewitz, Frau Clausewitz, who is, in many ways, people say, an intellectual rock star on par with Clausewitz and his real soulmate. Also, Jomini, besides the fact that Clausewitz died early before he could finish his book and promote it, Jomini was a huge self-promoter. I mean, he was a major self-promoter. He could have been, he would have a huge Twitter feed today. And he had 30 years after, more than Clausewitz did to promote his ideas, to tour the world. And he did. And his book became seminal. It became the number one text of strategic thought everywhere for 150 years, where Clausewitz was who is that? Von who? So he has a scientific optimism, which was very popular in the 18th and 19th century, that Clausewitz also was a child of the Enlightenment, but didn't take it too seriously. He carefully assessed his own biases and was a true critical thinker. Jomini less so. He treated war like a science. He treated it like a complicated problem, like a math problem. So remember all those digs that Clausewitz had against people who treat war as a math problem? Well, that's how most war strategists and thinkers were thinking about war. It wasn't unique to Jomini. It was everybody's. Jomini was perhaps the greatest of those thinkers in terms of at least his prominence. So he says that war's principles are immutable, and the art of war are his conclusions, his secrets revealed about how you can safely and easily win a war. Very simple. Now, the ideas of Clausewitz and Jomini today are a tangled mix. They are messed up and mixed up in all sorts of ways in the DNA of Western strategic culture, especially United States of America strategic culture, which is why I teach them together. It's hard to know where one begins and the others end. And you see experts all the time mix them up in an unacceptable way that makes you wonder if they read the texts. I'm not going to answer that question, but people mix up their ideas all the time. So one is Colonel of Infantry Harry Summers, who wrote a bestseller assessment of Vietnam after the Vietnam War. And he uses what he says is, Clausewitz to understand strategy, but then he uses completely Jominian logic. It's really fun to read in some ways. He's a famous thinker in the Army War College for saying that the U.S. Army would have won Vietnam. The military would have won Vietnam had those civilians not gotten in the way. Had they not tied the military's hands behind their backs, those meddling civilians, the military would have easily won Vietnam. And now we are in this period of shame. And we'll see if there's going to be a Harry Summers coming out of the post-Afghanistan, Iraq era too. So let's look at these two thinkers side by side. Clausewitz, probably not a fan of Jomini. He doesn't speak about Jomini, but he speaks against the types of Jomini thinking that Clausewitz would have found it detestable, because Jomini treats war as a complicated problem rather than a complex one. And Jomini is like, hey, look, I'm the bestseller, not you. Nobody knows your name. You're obsolete, blah, 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 mon chéri. They actually have a lot more in common than not, I think. They both look at war as armed politics. They were born of the Napoleonic era, and they thought in terms of warfare in this paradigm. They were both, sort of fathers of conventional war thinking, with a state-centric view of world affairs, a Westphalian view of world affairs, where states rule everything, not sub-state actors that don't count, and states resolve problems through military action like gladiators. So it's a military-centric, state-centric view of international affairs. It's a Westphalian warfare model. They both focus on military at the operational level. They say they're strategic thinkers, but all their focus, 95% of their thinking is really military operational art. They use history as a valuable teacher. They both believe in massing your superior mass on the enemy's decisive weak point for victory, and that offense is the key form of warfence, and defense if you have to. But its offense is the preferred form of warfare. But they have some differences too. The main difference is their epistemology and how they go about answering the question, what is war, or what is the art of war, or things like that. So Clausewitz asks the why question. He is a critical thinker. He treats war as a complex problem, and he inquires into the nature of war, the actual governing principles that define this phenomenon. And his conclusions are analytical. Jomini asks the how question. He treats war like a complicated problem, and his inquiry is how to win, mostly 19th century wars, and his conclusions are prescriptive, mostly for 19th century wars, which is one reason he is no longer read, where Clausewitz is seen to have more timeless analysis. Jominian's, his analysis became outdated, as did 19th century warfare. I'm going to put up a list of similarities and some differences to help you better understand Jomini. It's good to understand Jomini in relationship to Clausewitz. It's a sort of a shortcut, if you will, pedagogically. So Jomini really just focuses at the operational level of war. Clausewitz focuses also at the operational level of war, but he does crest into the strategic level in books, mainly in books 1 and 8. Jomini views history as relatively static, punctuated by heroes and geniuses. He takes on the great man theory of history. This was the historiography that was popular in the 19th century and even early 20th century, that viewed history was moved along by great men like Napoleon, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, great heroes who changed world affairs by living. That's what moves history forward, not economics or other things, cultural events. It's the great man theory. The great man theory is very out of vogue today, by the way. Clausewitz views history as more dynamic, more nuanced, and he understands that it's difficult to comprehend with certainty. He almost has this idea of historiography, that even histories have their own history. Jomini's writing style is more practical. It's for warriors of his day. It's meant to be read. It also includes logistics and some sea power. It sought audiences. He went around on book tours. It is highly prescriptive. He continued to revise it, and always in French. So he was always revising it and updating it for modern events in his day. Clausewitz, of course, it's first of all, it's a draft, and not even a whole draft. It's like a piecemeal draft. It's very abstract. It's in this dense German that nobody reads, and he dies before he can finish it. For war, Jomini looks at it as a complicated question mark. It can be mastered and adhered to with principles. Like a complicated problem, it can be reverse engineered and a solution set, a checklist derived, and that's how he structures, his book, The Art of War. Whereas Clausewitz views it as a complex problem. It's too complex to understand through formulaic approaches. This is where they would differ a great deal. So strategy for Jomini is a science, and for Clausewitz, it's an art. In fact, Clausewitz ridicules people like Jomini. I don't think it's personal against Jomini, but most of the bestsellers in Clausewitz's day were doing what Jomini is doing, when saying, here's my how-to guide to win, and becoming rich and famous as a result. For Civ Mill, Jomini reflects the thinking of his era. He's very conventional, that it's fixed, that civilians are in charge in peace, military is in charge when it's war. Whereas Clausewitz sees it as a dynamic and nuanced relationship, that generals are charged with waging war, but statesmen are there to put the brakes on and consider the political objectives of war. And this has to be a partnership, not always an easy one, but one cannot work in exclusion of the other. So as you can see, there's some similarities and quite a few differences. Let's look at 3 more core concepts of Jomini that still may be relevant today. Core concept number 1, he has these 4 military maxims. Remember, he has all these quips and quotes and maxims and, how-to guide. So he says, again, war is winnable if you just follow my simple truths, and no doubt if you lose, it's because you didn't follow my simple truths closely enough. So core concept 1, maxim. You have the 4 maxims. Strategy in a theater of war. So this is, for us, it's not real strategy, it's operational art. Operational art / strategy is offensive action to mass forces against the weaker enemy's decisive points and communication center. So Clausewitz say, yeah, I agree with that, Henry. Maneuver. You engage fractions of the hostile army with the bulk of your forces. So you've heard the term flank them. This is what that means, is that you take the masses of your force and you then gobble up their their force that might be fractured. And you take them prisoner, you kill them, you disappear them, whatever you need to do, I suppose. Tactically, mass is key against the decisive points. And you have to do this at the proper time with the proper energy. So here, he and Clausewitz agree. And this is Napoleonic warfare as well. Number 4, I think Clausewitz would say that is military genius. Core concept number 2, he has these 3 categories: strategy, grand tactics, and logistics. Strategy, grand tactics, and logistics. Like the Montoya rule, these words do not mean what you think they mean, at least from Jomini. So this is what strategy looks like for Jomini. It's a bunch of generals sitting around a map on a table, making campaign plans, making a military campaign plan. Now, in our modern concept, this is operational art. This is not strategy. Strategy uses all instruments of national power, not just the military ones. Strategy is comprehensive. It happens in war and in peace. Strategy is not this. So for him, and frankly for a lot of, amateur commentators on war today, they think this is what strategy is. They think that, and look at talking heads on news programs, they think strategy is generals getting around and how are we going to pacify Afghanistan. That's not what strategy is. But to Jomini, that's what strategy is. That's how a lot of people thought of strategy in his day. They were not thinking of strategy like Clausewitz. And this is one reason we have difficulty thinking today to separating strategy from operational art. Goes back to Jomini and others. Now, grand tactics. This is battlefield architecture. This is the idea. There are tactics and grand tactics, or I guess petite tactics. So petite tactics for Jomini is like you're a platoon leader, you got to take a bridge. That's petite tactics. Grand tactics is you're Napoleon and you're waging a large-scale battle. 20,000 troops versus 20,000 troops. That is grand tactics. You're Napoleon on the horse and you're fighting the battle in real time. Now, logistics, something that Clausewitz doesn't even consider, which is pretty significant to warfare, means all the things you got to do to make sure that your army can move and shoot, at a campaign level, the science of logistics. So if you put these all together, strategy decides where to act, logistics brings the troops to the point, and grand strategy decides the manner of execution and the deployment of troops. Simple, right? Voila, says Jomini. Core concept number 3, campaign design. We get our campaign design today largely from the legacy of Jomini, not Clausewitz. We don't even know it's Jomini doing the talking, but his fingerprints are everywhere, especially in NATO powers, especially in the United States of America. Things like decisive points, vocabulary you've heard before. These are points of possession that give military advantage and intermediary objectives. They can become intermediary objectives. There could be geographic decisive points, like capitals and key terrains and ports. There could be accidental points of maneuver. This is sort of like Waterloo or Gettysburg, where it's not a fixed position that you're aiming for. It's like the armies bump up to each other in Gettysburg, and there becomes a decisive battle. That's an accidental point of maneuver, Gettysburg. There are objective points. Again, language we use today. This is the objective of a military campaign. And it could be geographic, like fortresses or a line of a river. It could be maneuver. This is maneuvering as troops sort of maneuver, dancing with each other for position. We've seen this as a prelude to battle all the times in the 19th century and earlier. So here's examples. There's offensive objective points and defensive objective points. Offensive might be taking the enemy's capital. Defensive might be protecting your enemy's capital, like a king in a chessboard game. Now, there are these dreaded things called political objective points, which he really does not like. This is such a draggy thing, right? So you do these things to assuage an ally. So this is interesting because he and Clausewitz both talk about how political war is, but when you have to do a military maneuver for a political thing, which we consider today as the definition of strategy, when military victories translate into political ones and vice versa, he views this as a drag. So he's really just an operational art thinker, if you think, at the end of the day. So you have to do something like rescue, a small village to appease an ally. If they say you don't do it, then they're out of the alliance. And your king or your general, somebody tells you in a civil authority, you must do that. So you have to do this to maintain a coalition, but he looks at it as a huge distraction. And he views political objectives subordinate to strategic ones, which again mean operational art ones, because strategy to him is really operational art to us. So he looks at this, that these lead to some of the worst errors in campaign design, is when people do things for political purposes than strategic ones. And, he may have a point. I mean, look at the Battle of Stalingrad. Germany sort of upset its whole offensive into Russia to take Stalingrad because it was named Stalingrad. So Hitler's like, yeah, take Stalingrad. I want to really kind of like give it to Stalin. And then Stalin's like, no, you must die on this hill called Stalingrad. It's named after me. And that kind of really ends it. It's sort of the culminating point of victory for the Russians is Stalingrad. So perhaps there, Jomini would say, see, I told you so. Some more vocabulary you're very familiar with that goes back to Jomini, a line of operation. This is the line from the base through the decisive points to the objective point. And this is what makes the campaign. This is campaign design. So let's make an example here. Here's you at base headquarters. You are Private Kitten, and this is your headquarters fortress pillow. But you have to navigate and your objective is the tuna fish, all right? The tuna fish. So you have to go through some challenges. Like decisive point 1 is navigate the noise monster. Decisive point 2 is skirt around the sleeping beastie. And then you achieve your objective. This is your military campaign. This is a line of operation, perhaps, in a larger campaign. So this is Jominian campaign design, which we still live with today. Select a theater of war, operational art. Determine the decisive points in the theater. Select the bases and zones of operation, base at number 2. Designate your objective point. Take it, defeat the enemy, and utilize lines of operation. Now, a lot of this Clausewitz would probably agree with. Think of Napoleonic warfare, maybe not as linearly as this, but again, the 4 maxims of Jomini to how to fight and win, Clausewitz would agree with, and that is combines with this. It's legacy today. We still live with Jomini. Even though he's not taught in war colleges, his legacy still is alive and well. So Field Manual 3.0 Operations is full of Jominian thinking, the principles of war, the military decision-making process. These are all sort of Jominian concepts and like sort of complicated linearity rather than complex ones. We see in lines of operation. We use them in Afghanistan and we use them in Iraq. I find personally what we see on the screen, very problematic because it assumes a lot of causal relationships without any explanation at all. But leaving that aside, we still make lines of operation in our campaign planning. So again, these are more evidence or similar evidence to before that Jomini, despite the fact that he's forgotten, we still use him. In fact, Clausewitz and Jomini, it's better to think of them and treat them as a whole. We're weighting towards Clausewitz, and I think there's some very good reasons for that. But Jomini, to neglect him, I think, would be an omission. Now, so there are many critiques of Jomini and Clausewitz today. The common ones are they are not really strategy. Clausewitz and Jomini are not strategic thinkers. They are operational art, and they're campaign design, and they're too military. Clausewitz talks a little bit about the nature war in the beginning and the end of On War, but everything else is all about the military and mostly at operational art level, at the campaign level. It does not consider many non-kinetic instruments of power. It doesn't look at diplomacy or other instruments like economics, or it doesn't look at anything else. It's all military all the time. It's Napoleonic. It's Westphalian. It's conventional war. In this way, it is too regular war. We'll go to critiques of him. Forgive the repetition. So it's too conventional war. So how applicable is this today? And many people have argued that Clausewitz and Jomini are not applicable today. And then there's a Clausewitz tribe who think, no, they have never been more applicable than before. And this becomes a very acerbic debate. And this actually started in the 1950s with nuclear weapons. Because in nuclear weapons and nuclear warfare, people have argued that this, it negates the Clausewitzian or Jominian warfare because you go from 0 to 60 very quickly. You go from 0 to peace to nuclear annihilation in a matter of 30 minutes. And particularly WMD is non-conventional warfare. It views war as the failure of peace rather than a continuous spectrum of conflict. So again, it views war-like pregnancy. You either are or you're not. And this is also how laws of armed conflict view war. Laws of armed conflict today mirror Westphalian warfare, conventional warfare, the War of Jomini and Clausewitz. Again, you can see their legacy in the laws of armed conflict today. No attention is paid to what happens after war. There's no post-conflict. I'm not sure what you do. It neglects naval warfare. Clausewitz mentions it, but never in any serious manner. And Jomini mentions it more, but also, again, not seriously, like Mahan and others do, Corbett. Clausewitz doesn't even talk about logistics, which is a significant omission. And Jomini treats war like a complicated problem rather than a complex one. And he looks at it as a scientific problem that can be, reverse engineered and prescriptively, formulaically solved, of which Clausewitz strongly disagrees. Perhaps the best critique, fair or unfair, comes out of World War I. A lot of officers on both sides of that brutal war blamed Clausewitz and Jomini for the brutality and the senseless carnage of those wars. One was British Captain Little Hart, who became probably the most influential post-war strategic thinker in Great Britain, and he argues for something called indirect war, which we'll talk about later. But he says here, Clausewitz, and he's specifically referencing Clausewitz, had proclaimed the sovereign virtues of the will to conquer, the unique values of offensive carried out with unlimited violence by a nation in arms, and the power of the military action to override everything else. So he's got Clausewitz down to a T. And there's a lot of truth to this, I think, that the thinking of not just Jomini, but Clausewitz has a lot to answer for in the bloody carnage of World War I. For example, one can clearly trace Clausewitzian and Jominian philosophy in the grinding battles of attrition of 1916 and 17, like the battles of the Somme and Verdun. The British lost 60,000 troops in one day on July 1st in 2016 and woke up, 1916, and woke up the next day to do it all over again. That's more people killed in one day than all American casualties in the Vietnam War, which lasted 10 years. Also, the skepticism amongst generals on both sides for strategic maneuver became a tactical operational fight almost immediately. The accumulation of the maximum of force at the decisive point in order to defeat the enemy, forced battles in the Somme and other bloody places, the conduct of operations so as to inflict the greatest possible number of losses on the enemy and compel him to use up his reserves at a greater rate than was expending one's own reserves. This was the formula for victory. This is a bloody war of attrition. The dogged refusal to be put off by heavy casualties on both sides, Ludendorff or Haig, led to the carnage of this war. And officers on both sides who almost self-consciously embodied those qualities of calm and determination and perseverance, which Clausewitz had praised so highly. Was Liddell Hart wrong? I don't think he was. And is this the right war thinker or war thinkers for today? So I'll leave you with these brain teasers for next time. How relevant are these thinkers today? In what ways do you think their ideas remain worthy of study, or have they become obsolete? What are the timeless aspects of war versus the shifting characteristics of warfare, as Clausewitz sees this? Jomini does not make this distinction. What timeless aspects does a strategist need to know today? Should our thinking about Clausewitz's ideas change as we move from an era of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency into a renewed great power competition? If so, how? And again, are we also living in a post-Westphalian era? And if so, are Clausewitz's ideas, which are seen as the epitome of Westphalian war, which is a debatable claim, are they relevant for modern warfare? What is the utility of force in modern warfare? I mean, we all remember mission accomplished, do we not? The U.S. destroyed the Iraqi military in a few short weeks through using Clausewitzian and Jominian principles, but it made no difference for the strategic outcome of the war. Clausewitz is revered today as a strategic thinker par excellence. Do you agree with this? Does he deserve the place? Should we elevate him to the saint or prophet of war? Should he come down off the pedestal and just sit on the floor with the rest of the thinkers? Or do you think he's really kind of outmoded today? And how do you think about Jomini? So I leave these brain teasers with you. If you have any questions, you are free to contact me. I'm Dr. Sean McFate. And my email, my non-work email, is inquire@seanmcfate.com. Inquire@seanmcfate.com. Thank you very much. Have a good Clausewitzian or Jominian day.